English translation. 620th contact. Thursday the 23rd of April 2015. 22:34 hours.
And there you are, dear friend. I was having coffee in the kitchen with Hartmut and Madeleine when you called. Your coming surprises me because I was not expecting you, because I told Florina that.
Bernadette has a lecture next Saturday. I know why we cannot do our correction work, which we could not do today either. Nevertheless, I want to come here and see how you are doing. But greetings, dear Freud Edouard.
Of course, sorry. Greetings to you too, Pata, my good friend. But what I want to say is, I am relatively well again, but I had nothing to laugh about for about a month with regard to my health.
I felt the need to help you, but you refused my help.
You know I am not a wimp.
But obviously you would have needed my help after all.
I could have, but I did not want to.
I know that, but what really happened, if you want to explain that to me, please.
Is this really necessary?
Please.
If it has to be, good then. So it was about a month ago, as you already know, that I stumbled backwards, lost my balance, and fell full force with the left side of my body into a shelf, demolishing my ribs. The pain was halfway bearable, but after 5 days it became so severe that I could hardly breathe, let alone laugh or cough, and I could also no longer move without great pain, which is why I went to the doctor and had myself x-rayed to find out whether the ribs were broken or not. But the x-ray did not show anything definite, so it was unclear. To counteract the pain and inflammation, I was given 2 different medicines by the doctor. My family doctor had an emergency, so I had to go to a substitute doctor, but they did not work against the pain and inflammation. But after 2 days they caused severe dizziness, so I threw them away. Of course, that was already too late, because the dizziness continued and also drove up my blood pressure, which rose above 200 over 177 and caused me great problems. Sitting on the sofa in the living room, I gasped for air for about 15 minutes while everything blurred before my eyes, and I could no longer move or even talk. While on my forearm and the back of my hand, the blood was rushing up through the pores, and I felt sick to my stomach. In fact, I thought that once again it was time for me to stand on the precipice, do the surly, and chew the familiar last of the grass. It was only after about 15 minutes that I was able to call the night watch. Bernadette, who was in the kitchen at the time and who also called Eva, who of course immediately notified the emergency medical service, who took me to the hospital in Winterthur. In the morning, however, Atlantis was able to pick me up again, because apart from my blood pressure, which had dropped again, everything was fine. Well, the next few days the blood pressure dropped to 89 over 61, which continued for several days with alternating low blood pressure and further dizzy spells. Then, according to my GP, I had to stop my tinnitus medication, for which I was given a replacement medication, but this again brought with it an unpleasant side effect, namely watery diarrhea, which lasted 4 days and completely hollowed me out, eventually making me sick as a dog and staggering around when I walked. In this state, a toothache and suppuration from a broken tooth began, so I had to go to the dentist in Pfaffakon, who removed the rest of the tooth and the suppuration. Eventually I got dog-tired and could hardly stay on my feet, which meant that, apart from small interruptions when I had to run to the toilet, I slept for about 60 hours over the next 3 days. Then, last Saturday, I remembered that in Zahedan, in Persia, I had severe dysentery, that is to say bacterial enteritis, in the narrower sense an inflammatory disease of the large intestine with a bacterial infection, also known as bacterial dysentery. And that's also how bad my diarrhea was last week. Well, anyway, I remembered that I had drunk a can of Fanta in Persia, because I had nothing else to hand, and that it had helped the severe diarrhea to improve, which I then also countered with enterioviform, which cleared everything up. I explained this to Bernadette, after which she left on Sunday morning and went to a motorway shop to get some bottles of Fanta, which in turn, as in Persia, began to stop the diarrhea. Since then, everything has started to improve, and it has turned into constipation, which I also have to get rid of now, But this is no problem and will be solved tomorrow, because I have already treated myself with black coffee, which solves such a problem for me. Apart from the demolished ribs and the full-sided lump on the left side of my body, which still gives me some trouble, like when driving and when lying down or sleeping, everything is in good condition again in the meantime. So everything is really okay again now, so you do not have to bother doctoring me anymore. And that is really meant seriously, my son.
I can see it on your face, so I do not want to ask about it either, and you have already given your answer. But what can I say to your presentation than that the whole thing is typical for you, but that the whole thing was obviously opposite of harmless? You really should accept help in certain situations and not just go through everything alone with your own strength.
As I said, dear friend, it is not in me to be a wimp. And on the other hand, I am used to getting through a lot of things on my own, helping myself to get back on my feet in each case, and that too, even when it is sometimes arduous and troublesome. But in this way, Ptah, I can stand before myself, whereby I think that it can be seen in proportion the same as in relation to standing before oneself. If one fulfills one's duty all round, be it with regard to the shaping of life, the conduct of life, work, humanity, fellow helpfulness for all living beings, the keeping of freedom, peace, and harmony, as well as the observance of the creational natural laws and recommendations and general righteousness.
To which I can only agree with you.
Good. Then that is also clear, and so I can now once again talk about the crop circles, of which one only rarely hears anything nowadays, because they have gone out of fashion, so to speak. And because on the other hand it was already certain about 25 years ago that the actual first authors of the pictograms admitted that they fabricated the crop circles in England for fun, which then found imitators in England and even in Europe and the whole world. I had forgotten the names of the two decisive authors of the crop circles, although you had already told me the names of the authors of the crop circles at the beginning of the appearance of the first crop circles, which I was supposed to keep silent about for whatever reason. The reason did not interest me and does not interest me now. Well, in the meantime, I had forgotten the names of the two men, but in the last few days I searched for them on the internet and also found them, and also a description of the whole story.
The names of the two men were Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley.
Correct. That is also in the description of the facts, which can be found on the internet under Spiegel Online, dated 4.9. 2012 under the title Einestages.
Can I read the description?
Of course, I copied it out, but before you read it, I want to clarify something. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, we talked about crop circles on various occasions, and you always said that they were made by Earthlings, and in a rather primitive way, as I was once able to see for myself with your help. In the making of the crop circles, however, it did not remain with the two older men who trampled these pictograms into the grain, as I have already mentioned, but there were many imitators around the world who also made crop circles, in the same way as Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley. In the end, the whole thing became a real crop circle hysteria, which has died down again today. But there are still many fantasists who believe that the pictograms were created by extraterrestrials or by magical powers, etc., and would still be created today if Earthlings stepped on them again in some crop fields. What interests me now is what you have said several times, that on the one hand energy pictographs can appear in cornfields as well as in meadows and forests, but that they are not produced by Earthlings, but can appear through ruins hidden in the earth, watercourses, and magnetic factors. But you were not allowed to give any information about this, because everything belongs to the area of earthly scientific research, which you were not allowed to disclose according to your directives, because this had to be reserved for earthly researchers, and must also continue to be reserved. In the meantime, however, earthly technology is so advanced in every respect that scientists with the appropriate apparatus and equipment have been able to detect and record such natural phenomena for many years, whereby ruins and watercourses, etc., hidden in the earth can also be detected and explored. This is correct, or?
That is correct, because according to our directives, we are not allowed to state any secrets of that kind as findings and facts.
I know that. That's why I also never ask why I have to keep quiet about anything when you confide in me things that I do not really want to know sometimes. What I would like to know now, however, relates to your statements that extraterrestrial forces have also been involved in the crop circle productions and can also continue to be involved. Basically, all crop circles, and indeed all crop circles without exception, were and are made by Earthlings, whereby they are called pictograms by so-called crop circle researchers and crop circle believers. Nevertheless, you have said that extraterrestrial forces are also involved and play a decisive role. I know what it is about, and how it is to be understood, and that it is not about extraterrestrials who have their fingers in the pie. Because these extraterrestrial forces are based on natural universal vibrations, which let an artistic vein vibrate in the human beings, so to speak, through which they create artistic structures. Can you explain something about that, please?
Universe-wide, a creational natural movement vibrates, which spreads artistic impulses in many forms. For example, predominantly in relation to geometric and symmetrical forms, which are important in the production of crop circles. Because the Earth humans who produce these pictograms absorb these vibrations and transform them into works of art according to their meaning, as in pictograms, which they then press into crop fields by treading down the stalks of grain. Apart from geometrical and symmetrical forms, the extraterrestrial or cosmic energetic impulses of art also impart many other forms of art, such as painting, carving, sculpture, drawing and music, etc. I have explained various things to you in earlier private conversations, such as that these creational, natural, artistic impulses are of a universal energetic vibrational nature and are also contained in the cosmic electromagnetic life energy and stimulate the consciousness of human beings through their subconsciousness in order to become artistically active and to represent and create all kinds of art forms, be it drawing, sculpting, or in any other artistic way. Human beings in particular, as well as other life forms who are sensitive enough to pick up these vibrations contained in the cosmic electromagnetic life energy, can also translate them into many different forms. This is especially true of human beings who have artistic abilities and interests, so that they are especially predisposed or talented to absorb these vibrations. This creational natural art-mediating vibration also affects all other living beings, such as animals, birds, insects, reptiles, aquatic creatures, and amphibians, for which the universal art vibrations are important for nest building or for mate-making and the play instinct, etc. The same also happens with regard to minerals, which are solids and have a defined chemical composition, and also a defined physical crystalline structure. Many of them form themselves into geometrical and symmetrical figures, which consistently arise as universal art from the corresponding creational natural artistic vibrations. So this art arises not only in Earth humans, but also throughout the universe in all of nature, in which geometric and symmetrical forms of all kinds are formed through the extraterrestrial or creational natural art vibrations, such as, for example, galaxies, circles, crosses, rings, cubes, and many other geometrical and symmetrical forms, whereby for Earth humans the best known in this respect are the crystal forms which arise in minerals of all kinds, but also in snowflakes in infinite variations and in ice formations, etc. From this point of view is to be understood what my daughter Simyase, as well as Quetzal and I, have said in regard to extraterrestrial forces which are involved in the production of crop circle formations. So it is not earthly planetary vibrations, but extraterrestrial ones, which are of universal form. The Earth humans who made or continue to make such crop circle pictograms thus find their ideas for them in the extraterrestrial or creational natural universal artistic vibrations through which all life forms and all minerals and plants derive benefit. Plants of all kinds use this extraterrestrial art vibration to form their shapes, just as Earth humans use it to be artistically active in whatever way, while other life forms use this creational natural art vibration in various other ways according to their species and kind. And because this art vibration does not emanate from Earth, but moves creatively, naturally, universe-wide, we call it extraterrestrial and universal.
This is once clearly explained, consequently no more misunderstandings can occur. Your explanation also says that the art forms are very diverse, which are spread universally by the universal energetic vibrations. Thus, with regard to geometrical and symmetrical forms, I am thinking of trapezoids, parallelograms, squares, cubes, cuboids, pyramids, cones, spheres, cylinders, triangles, quadrilaterals, pentagons, hexagons, rectangles, polygons, right-angled, isosceles and equilateral shapes, as well as prisms, rhombuses, tetrahedrons, icosahedrons, dodecahedrons, octahedrons, cuboctahedrons, ellipsoids, paraboloids, pentagrams, and etc. as they come to my mind at the moment.
Everything you name is correct, of course.
The art-mediating cosmic energetic, that is to say universal energetic vibrations, also appear in other ways, such as with regard to sounds and tones, which are also received and converted by human beings, namely in the form of music. I also talked about this with Christian when answering forum questions, saying that you and I had talked about it the other day. Unfortunately, I could not find anything about it in the last conversation report, so it must have been earlier.
We talked about that in private, consequently there is no written record.
Oh, well, I guess I am a bit confused as a result of my health damage, which is now about a month on. Then we can speak 2 or 3 words today that refer to the sounds, tones and music in nature, precisely that it is the case that all other living beings are also affected by it, and even all gross and subtle matter as well as all subtle matter in all universal expanse. All plants and all life forms in general, as well as all atoms and all even tinier substances, as well as all planets, suns, comets, meteors, nebulae and asteroids, etc., move through these sound and tone vibrations, whereby they each produce a kind of music in their own way, which I would like to call a total universal musical hissing and humming, whereby a certain healing power is also emanated in many respects. So every life form, no matter what species or kind, is also struck by these universal energetic musical vibrations together with the cosmic electromagnetic life energy, and emits harmonious or disharmonious sounds and tones according to its own individuality, which I will therefore call a kind of music. Even your father Svath explained all this to me in this way.
Then I need not give any further explanation on that. But now let me read the description you spoke of, because I am really interested.
As you like, of course. Look here, in the computer you can read the whole thing.
Thanks.
One Day Spiegel Online, a question of the ear crop circles phenomenon by Steve Alexander.
Cosmic or strange? Extraterrestrial or extraordinarily terrestrial? In the 80s, hundreds of mysterious crop circles caused a sensation in the south of England. Experts found no explanation. Even the military investigated until 2 elderly gentlemen revealed a spectacular secret. By Solveig Grota Tuesday, 04.09. 2012, 10:01 hours. Presumably alcohol had played some role. In a cosy pub called Percy Hobbs near Winchester in southern England, 2 gentlemen sat together on a summer evening in 1978. They talked and drank as they had done on almost every Friday for more than 10 years. Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley were artists. Their conversation revolved around painting, watercolors, and at one point UFOs. Doug, who had lived in Australia for a few years, remembered that the Queensland newspapers had reported a strange phenomenon, a patch of flattened reeds near Tully. The farmers called it a UFO nest. Doug and Dave laughed at the story. 3 years later, in the summer of 1981, British media reported a mysterious phenomenon in the south of England: crop circles. Places where the grain was depressed in circles. In the past hundreds of years, this had happened from time to time, but now an inexplicable accumulation could be observed in the hilly landscape. The news spread far beyond England's borders. Thousands of onlookers arrived. Farmers, initially angered by the destruction of their crops, came to terms with the mystery and collected entrance fees at their fields. The strange spots, circles of various sizes and constellations, aroused the interest of various self-proclaimed experts, but soon also that of scientists and finally the British government. Despite years of speculation and attempts at interpretation, ranging from natural phenomena to the paranormal, no conclusive explanation was found. With Operation Blackbird, accompanied and supported by Ministry of Defense officials and armed forces patrols, a team led by Operations Chief Colin Andrews hoped to get closer to an answer. The operation, funded by the BBC and Japanese television, aimed to film the formation of a crop circle for the first time. Equipped with heat, light and sound detectors, the participants took up position on a hill near Westbury in Wiltshire in July 1990. And indeed, by the second evening, the operation seemed to succeed. The surveillance equipment detected orange lights in a nearby field. Andrews' hasty report of success, however, made a mockery of those involved. For in daylight, they not only found the spot with the circularly depressed grain, but also a so-called witchboard in it, as used by fortune-tellers. Unknown jokers had left it there, along with a wire that had served them as a tool. The orange light registered by the heat sensors was probably caused by the heated bodies of the eager creators. After yet another summer of mass gatherings and mysterious formations, the two friends Doug and Dave had had enough of the hustle and bustle in the neighborhood. The spectacle had become creepy to them, and they wanted to put an end to it once and for all. The British newspaper Today appeared on Monday the 9th of September 1991 with a very exclusive story. The cover read in huge letters, "The Men Who Deceived the World," and featured the portraits of two mischievously smiling men in their mid-60s, Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley. Not of this world. In the inside section, the paper gleefully explained how the two men were asked to give a test demonstration to prove their claim that they were the authors of at least 200 crop circles. How the crop circle expert and best-selling author Patrick Delgado, who believed the apparitions to be cosmic hieroglyphs, was brought in to examine them. And as the unsuspecting Delgado finally explained, what we are dealing with here, nobody in the world can understand. We are confronted with the fact that these plants have been laid down in this sensational pattern by an energy that remains inexplicable and testifies to a high degree of intelligence. No human beings would be able to create something like this. Delgado and Blackbird Chief Andrews, meanwhile, were not the only experts who had been fooled. The Canadian meteorologist Terence Meaden had taken up an assumption to explain the formation of crop circles, which the renowned scientific journal Nature had already reported on 100 years earlier, namely that crop circles could be caused by cyclones. Meaden assumed that the air currents in the hilly landscape of southern England created electrostatic vortices that were capable of forming such circles. The more complicated the circular formations became, the more sophisticated Meaden's explanations became. His theory reached its limits when Bauer and Chorley finally introduced straight lines into their artworks, which certainly could not be of natural origin. At night in Devil's Punch Bowl, it was all so simple. That very evening, after the pub crawl in the summer of 1978, the two men had wanted to have some fun. They got an iron bar that Bauer usually used to secure the back door of his picture-framing business in Southampton, sneaked it along the tractor track into a field, spun around in circles with the bar horizontally at knee height, and laughed themselves to death. They repeated the action several times, not only in the summer of 1978, but every summer from then on, always with the hope that someone would take notice and that it would be in the papers at some point. But nothing happened for 3 years. They were all the more pleased when in 1981, grain was grown for the first time in Devil's Punch Bowl, a valley west of Hindhead. They could hardly wait for the stalks to grow, because the field was visible from the road. Here their circles would not go unnoticed. By now, the two artists had refined their methods. Their tool consisted of a wooden slat, both ends of which were connected with a rope. The men held the rope in their hands, and with their right foot on the board, they pushed the plants down in front of them, round after round, if possible without breaking them. For straight stretches, Bauer had made a ring on his peaked cap with a wire, through which he could aim at an object in the distance and thus never lose direction. Taken to task, Bauer and Chorley spent countless summer nights in the field in this way, without ever being caught. But they had to fear for their lives when hunters apparently mistook them for game and shot at them. Another time, they told the newspaper, they were suspicious of a police patrol. But the police were satisfied with the explanation that the two men were investigating bird calls. Only his wife had not been able to fool Bauer in the long run. She had noticed that her husband often did not come home at night. In the 6th year, she became suspicious and confronted him. Just as she had seen in a feature film, she had checked the car's mileage and discovered that her husband had driven 400 miles in 1 week. Doug thought he could quickly allay the suspicion that there was another woman by showing Eileen the sketches of her nocturnal creations. However, she did not believe him at first and demanded a precise prediction of the next apparition as proof. The two men were to encounter the credibility problem more often. After the supposed experts, Delgado and Andrews, had been exposed in such a revealing way by Today, they had changed their minds 2 days later. They now claimed to journalists that the circle of Bauer and Chorley was undoubtedly not a real crop circle, because the stalks were recognizably broken, not bent. This could hardly come as a surprise, however, as dozens of teams of reporters from all over the world had trampled over the sign in question in the crop field after the sensational revelation. Works of higher intelligence. However, one thing the two mischievous seniors had by no means achieved was that the hype was finally over. Meteorologist Maiden continued to believe in his vortex theory and that crop circles occur naturally. And new people kept contacting Today who had developed their own explanations, claimed authorship, or wanted to have seen extraterrestrials. The news of the Southern English phenomenon had caused the number of crop circle sightings reported worldwide to increase rapidly, and their creation developed into a true art form, with ever more complicated figures of circles, lines, and polygons, for which far more than just a few boards and ropes were needed. Some of the artists now orient themselves by means of lasers or GPS devices. The stalks themselves, wrote physicist Richard Taylor of the University of Oregon, could be flipped with so-called magnetrons using microwave radiation. Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley, however, are regarded in crop circle circles as the founders of this new art form, their self-imposed rules as unwritten laws. These include that the grain may only be bent, not broken. The pictograms must be created during the night and their creators must leave the field without leaving any human traces. And even if the involvement of flying objects, unknown or known, in the creation of crop circles could not be proven, their fascinating beauty can only really be grasped from the perspective of the supernatural, from a balloon, a plane, or a helicopter.
And what do you think?
What more can I say to that? The matter has been settled.
Of course, that's all there really is to say. But what interests me now is this. For my part, I have been able to observe on various occasions in the course of my life that something like circular formations formed not only in cornfields, meadows, rape fields, maize fields, and in reed areas, which I believe were due to air vortices and storms. But what is now with the claim that there are verifiable records relating to crop circles that appeared as far back as the Middle Ages and antiquity?
This does not correspond to the truth, but to pure delusional claims and falsifications of reports by crop circle believers, etc. What, on the other hand, has also appeared in ancient times, these were natural phenomena, as you have just explained them from your own observations.
Cannot be otherwise than something else. It is true that your father Svath has already explained to me that plants do not feel pain, but they can react to vibrations, like the mimosa, for example, as I have observed myself. If plants do not feel pain, they can still react to it. For example, if they are beaten, cut, pressed, or eaten by human beings or by animals and creatures. The plants of all genera and species, as Svath taught me, if I understood him correctly, are organized in a decentralized way, which means that all organs of each plant work independently, but each organ informs all other organs by impulse what it is doing or what is happening to it. This information takes place via a very fine electrical field or via very fine electrical impulses. This extremely fine electrical energy is inherent in every plant, from the smallest and finest fungus and moss to the largest tree. Consequently, as Svath taught me, each individual plant is also capable of deciding in an electrical impulse manner and, for example in the case of injuries, to treat itself in a healing or protective way, or, if it is inherent in the plant, to grow again and keep itself alive. Now, if you can perhaps explain a little more about this, please, because I would like to refresh my memory a little in this respect, because some of what your father Svath explained to me is no longer familiar to me.
That my father taught you about these things in your childhood and youth is known to me. And if you are not able to remember everything exactly, then I will gladly do something to help you brush up on everything. So I will begin by saying that what you have repeated from memory is correct. It is also to be said that the feeling and perception of pain in a physiological sense requires a consciousness and thus also a brain and a central nervous system, which, however, is generally lacking in all plants. These factors correspond to a basic prerequisite which, however, is not inherent to plants. Consequently, they can also not feel pain. Nor do they have comparable systems that would give them the complex abilities to feel and perceive pain, which, however, does not prevent them from picking up many kinds of vibrations through which they protect or develop themselves according to their species or kind and their possibilities. Just as they can alert their neighboring plants to a danger or something pleasing, just also according to the possibilities specifically assigned to them.
As I already mentioned in relation to my experience with a mimosa, plants can also pick up vibrations from human beings and react to them. Plants can also perceive touch, however, as is visibly the case with the living mimosa, for example, when it is touched and the leaves curl up as a result.
This is indeed the case, and everything is based on fine electrical impulses. But in fact, all genera and species of plants are capable of perceiving very many vibrations and diverse environmental influences, to which they also react in very diverse ways according to their genus or species.
Communication and Empathy of Plants. Source 1. The Intelligence of Plants, How Botanical Plants Communicate with Each Other underground by Suzanne Billig and Petra Geist.
Plants defend themselves, sometimes even against animals. AP HTTPS WW. Future of Mankind? COE. UK/W/images/9/9D/CR620, Image 1. JPG.
Researchers suspect that the roots of plants form a huge Earth-spanning communication network. They can also do far more above Earth than is suspected. Plants defend themselves very cleverly and even lure helpers over when an animal threatens to eat them. South Africa, Kruger National Park. Antelopes approach a group of acacias. The animals pluck at the leaves of a tree and enjoy the juicy taste. After a while, the animals trot to the next tree, but it tastes bitter. So do the leaves of the neighbors. The whole forest has suddenly become inedible. Hungry, the antelopes move on. 1-0 for the acacias. They have successfully defended themselves against the ravenous animals. But what exactly has happened? For a long time, researchers saw plants as little more than living robots, subject to a stubborn growth program. But gradually, modern biology is saying goodbye to the image of the plant as a passive organism. Green things can talk. The example of the acacia tree shows this. However, plants do not communicate with sounds, but chemically via ethylene. If an acacia is nibbled, it emits the odorless, sweetish gas. The surrounding trees understand the signal and drastically increase the amount of tannin in their leaves. The result, an unpleasant taste and digestive problems for the grazing animals. This is a gaseous molecule, ethylene, which is also called the language of plants, whispering and chattering, which is secreted by a plant in very many situations. The above-ground part does that. The leaves, that can go up to several 100 meters, the message. Dieter Volkmann is Professor Emeritus from the Institute of Cellular and Molecular Biology at the University of Bonn. The gas is volatile, is immediately driven away by wind to the neighbors. The neighbors know something has happened next door. We have to arm ourselves and set a defense system in motion much earlier and thus ward off the frass enemy, reduce it, and so on. For many years, Professor Volkmann has belonged to that small group of researchers who are working worldwide to revolutionize our view of the plant. Their work does not meet with undivided approval. Many botanists consider the interpretations exaggerated. Can grasses and trees really see, hear, smell, taste, and feel, as Dieter Volkmann and his colleagues say? Research today knows of at least 17 environmental factors that plants constantly scan and process. Gravity, light, humidity, temperature, nutrients, and scents are among them. Plants also know whether their roots are touching the roots of relatives or those of other species. Plants are true perception artists. The redberry fence beet, a climbing plant, is so sensitive that it can feel a thread weighing less than 1/1,000,000th of a gram. This is far beyond the sensory capabilities of animals and human beings. Plants also register UV light very precisely. If it is too much for them, they form pigments that act like sunscreen. If a plant detects a viral infection, its response is called aspirin. It produces salicylic acid and thus strengthens its defenses. A plant's chance of survival depends on how precisely it perceives its environment. After all, it is firmly rooted in one place and can neither flee nor strike nor bite. Plants not only warn each other of enemies, they also call the enemies of their enemies to their aid and offer what is extraordinarily appreciated in the animal kingdom. They then eat their fill on a silver platter. Caterpillar alarm in the maize field. In its distress, the maize produces a scent. It attracts the ichneumon wasp, Cotasia marginiventris. Its larvae love precisely this type of caterpillar as food. The entire maize field sends out SOS. Finally, the little ichneumon wasps smell the message and come in droves. Soon their larvae will consume the pest from the inside. Mission accomplished. Plants register very precisely who is hurting them. A small damage to the leaf is not enough. The chemical SOS call is only sent when the plant has identified the attacker from the saliva. Is it the common spider mite or the linden spider mite? The plant's scent cry tells its hungry helpers. It is a very complicated network of communication between different organisms. On the one hand, a feeding enemy of the plants, but on the other hand, a protective insect of the plant, insofar as it attacks an enemy of the insects again and kills it in favor of the plant. Modern cultivated plants have lost these abilities, by the way. They can no longer understand the alarm calls of their conspecifics and are themselves incapable of warning. They have been bred to be dumb and deaf. In the wild, plants do not only communicate above ground, there is also a lively exchange below earth. This is ensured by the gigantic dynamic network of roots researchers speak of the wood wide web with a wink. Fungi play a decisive role in communication within the wood wide web, as they say today, namely symbiotic fungi, that is to say, fungi that work together with the plants and help the plants to access nutrients. And this underground system of fungal filaments exists for every tree, and this is possibly distributed over the whole earth. So there is an underground communication system for the plants via the fungal system. The threads of the fungi penetrate the root cells, grow together with them, and connect the roots to each other. The exchange of information takes place via messenger substances that are soluble in water and can be read by the roots like emails, so to speak. Are the plants in the neighborhood relatives or strangers? Are harmful bacteria, fungi, or animals approaching? Valuable information that the root needs to get help, activate defense systems, or flexibly adjust its growth to the situation. Plant roots do not only work with chemical signals. Recently, scientists also found electrical signals. The electrical signals move forward at 1 centimeter per second, similar to the slow nerve signals in jellyfish or worms. The impulses flow through the thin tubes that supply the plant with nutrients. But why do plants need electricity? Because they also sometimes have to react quickly. When a root encounters poison, it grows in a different direction after only a few seconds. A message can only be transmitted so rapidly electrically. František Baluska, professor at the University of Bratislava in Slovakia and head of a research group at the Institute for Cellular and Molecular Biology at the University of Bonn. Roots are sometimes in dangerous situations. There are toxic areas, areas without water, areas that are too salty, and sometimes also simply stones. The root has to avoid these areas. And there is some evidence that roots can somehow sense such dangers. Then they show avoidance growth. The root turns left or right and grows around that area. In the case of stones, they typically grow towards the stone, scan its surface, and then find the open space where they grow back down towards gravity. Emotions in plants? Can roots actually do more than passively respond to stimuli? Do they even end up harboring something like a plant brain deep down in the dark soil? Of course, plants do not have a brain, plant researchers readily admit. But a kind of perception center can be found in roots, says František Baluska. A special zone above the root tip perceives stimuli from outside, reacts to them, and adapts to new situations. And some of its functions are not so dissimilar to a brain. It is not the whole root tip, but a small zone that we call the transition zone. And this zone seems to be very, very active. There is no cell growth there, but there is recycling of small cell vesicles, and there is electrical activity. That indicates that the zone has a task. What task? We've been studying that, and now the data indicates that the zone has very similar properties to our brain cells. The special cells above the root tip transport tiny fluid-filled vesicles back and forth called vesicles. They contain neurotransmitters, chemical messengers, just like in animal synapses, the switching points between the nerve cells. Gradually, the researchers are gaining a picture of what the root tip does. When it perceives light or a toxin, it transmits the information to the transition zone. Here, the message is processed with other information, and the result is sent to the root's growth zone. The root can now make sensible progress in the soil. Perceiving the environment. Converting sensory stimuli into messages and distributing them in the body. Reacting flexibly and creatively. Are plants intelligent? Do they have a consciousness? Professor Dieter Volkmann, I would be very cautious about using the word consciousness. What matters to us is that plants are capable of much more than we have thought so far, than everyone has known so far. And if we disregard the time factor, because the time factor is the decisive difference between the plant and the animal, then we are very much approaching the area where plant and animal come very close to each other. If we take time-lapse pictures, a root tip looks exactly like this. It behaves exactly like a worm that crawls here and crawls there. It is just a question of time. The image of the communicating, creative plant is still only emerging in outline. And many scientists are still skeptical about the new image of the plant, but research continues.
Source 2. Ultrasonic sounds trees sigh when they lack water. Wednesday, 23.07. 2014, 6:59 hours.
If they suffer from a lack of water, trees emit sounds? You have never heard this before? No wonder, because trees sigh in the ultrasonic range. French scientists have now discovered the reason for this phenomenon, which has been known for some time. According to them, ultrasonic waves are generated when bubbles form in the vessels that conduct the plant sap, due to negative pressure, and the water thread breaks off. The strength of the waves is related to the size of the vessels and the degree of dryness. Write Alexandre Ponomarenko from the Laboratoire Interdisciplinaire de Physique in Grenoble and his colleagues in the Journal of the Royal Society Interface. In future, ultrasound sensors could therefore detect how much trees suffer from a lack of water.
This pine tree probably sighs rather rarely for lack of water. For one thing, it stands in rainy Britain, and for another, the 200-year-old tree in the Oxford Botanic Gardens was Tolkien's favorite, and is presumably lovingly cared for as such.
As early as the 1960s, researchers have recorded the clicking sounds of trees in the audible frequency range, writes Ponomarenko's team. In the 1980s, they then recorded ultrasound emissions. These emissions are said to occur more frequently when trees lack water. However, their cause was unclear until now. Vibrating vessel walls generate ultrasound waves. To clarify this, the researchers embedded 50mm thick sections of Scots Pinus sylvestris in a hydrogel. This substance allows water to pass through but not air. The researchers wanted to use it to observe how the bubbles form in the vessels, without having a direct connection to the air. They placed the pine sample and hydrogel in a dry environment where water evaporated from the hydrogel. This created a water shortage for the embedded piece of pine.
With the help of a resistograph, experts such as Mr. Matisse from Berliner Baumdienst GmbH Kusha and partner can analyze the stability of the tree. Warning signal. If mushrooms are growing on the tree trunk, layperson should better consult a professional. Professional pruning. Arborists undertake the removal of dead branches even at great heights.
The scientists found that the following happens in the vessels that conduct the plant sap. In the case of strong evaporation via needles or leaves, a negative pressure is created that sucks the liquid upwards in the vessels. If there is no rain, the tension in the liquid and in the vessels increases. At some point, the water thread breaks. A tiny vacuum bubble is created, which immediately fills water vapor and air dissolved in the water. When the water column breaks, the vessel walls oscillate back and forth a few times, creating the ultrasonic waves. Climate change causes severe droughts. Ponomarenko and colleagues monitored the pine tree visually with a magnifying and high-resolution camera and acoustically with very sensitive microphones. With few exceptions, they were able to match every acoustic signal in the range of milliseconds to a bubble observed by camera. However, not all bubbles resulted in an ultrasound signal. The authors suspect that some acoustic signals may have been beyond the resolution of the microphones. The physicists found that the tree's ultrasound signals changed with increasing water shortage. Their conclusion: there is now great potential to use a simple and non-invasive ultrasound sensor to track the effects of severe droughts associated with climate change on forest survival.
Source 3. When water shortage makes trees sigh. The phenomenon has been known to science for some time. When water becomes scarce, trees emit sounds, at least in the ultrasonic range. French researchers have discovered what is behind it. By Stéphane Pache.
Pine forest in the warm light of the evening sun near Petersdorf.
When water is scarce, trees emit sounds, but in the ultrasonic range. French scientists have now discovered the reason for this phenomenon, which has been known for a long time. According to them, ultrasonic waves are generated when bubbles form in the vessels that conduct the plant sap due to negative pressure and the water thread breaks off. The strength of the waves is related to the size of the vessels and the degree of dryness. Alexandre Ponomarenko from the Laboratoire Interdisciplinaire de Physique in Grenoble and his colleagues write in the Journal of the Royal Society Interface. In the future, ultrasound sensors could detect how much trees suffer from a lack of water. As early as the 1960s, researchers recorded the clicking sounds of trees in the audible frequency range, writes Ponomarenko's team, and in the 1980s, ultrasound emissions were recorded. It was considered certain that these emissions occur more frequently when there is a lack of water. However, their cause was unclear. To clarify this, the researchers embedded 50-millimeter thick sections of Scots pine Pinus sylvestris in a hydrogel. This substance lets water through but not air. This is because the researchers wanted to observe how the bubbles form in the vessels without having a direct connection to the air. They placed the pine sample and hydrogel in a dry environment where water evaporated from the hydrogel. This created a water shortage for the embedded small piece of pine.
The tallest trees in the world.
Vessel walls swing back and forth. If there is no supply, the tension in the liquid and in the vessels increases. At some point, the water thread breaks, creating a tiny vacuum bubble that is immediately filled by water vapor and air dissolved in the water. When the water column breaks off, the vessel walls oscillate back and forth a few times, generating the ultrasound waves. Ponomarenko and colleagues monitored the pine tree optically with a magnifying and high-resolution camera and acoustically with very sensitive microphones. With few exceptions, they were able to match every acoustic signal in the range of milliseconds to a vesicle observed by camera. However, not all bubbles resulted in an ultrasonic signal. The authors suspect that some acoustic signals may have been beyond the resolution of the microphones. The physicists found that the tree's ultrasound signals changed with increasing water shortage. Their conclusion: there is now great potential to use a simple and non-invasive ultrasonic sensor to track the effects of severe droughts associated with climate change on forest survival.
Source 4. Thirsty plants send signals. Drought stress produces ultrasound biology in Our Time, December 2010, 406. DOI 10.1002 buyers 201010436.
Abstract ultrasonic emission analysis, a method from the field of non-destructive testing, can also be used to analyze sound emissions in plants. In the water transport system of plants, sound waves in the audible and ultrasonic range occur when high tensile stresses lead to sudden breakage of water filaments. These cavitations are triggered by air escaping from neighboring conductive elements. Ultrasonic events can also be observed during the freezing of drying wood samples. Ultrasonic emission analysis allows monitoring of cavitations as a function of tensile stress, but the interpretation of the registered events is often difficult. Future technical developments and research activities will make it possible to better understand these plant acoustic emissions.
Source 5. Plant communication. The whisper of pines. Biologists hear what is being talked about in the forest. Plants call for help, share nutrients and exchange information about the weather. By Burkhard Strassmann, Die Zeit, N24, 201422, June 2014, 1544 hours.
A typical German pine forest in the morning. Who is whispering here? Copyright Jens Briesenig Flicker.
A man stands in the forest, very still and silent. He has put on a pair of headphones, which are attached to electronic equipment that is connected to a forest pine tree by several cables. The tree is equipped with plasters, probes, and sensors, like a serious case in intensive care. The man is engaged in an unusual occupation. He eavesdrops on trees. And indeed, the Scots pine, Pinus sylvestris, whispers. "I am thirsty," says the tree. Such oddities are told by Roman Zweifel, the man standing in the forest with headphones near the wine village of Salgesch in the Swiss Valais. He is a biologist employed by the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow, and Landscape Research. In the inner alpine dry zone 50 kilometers east of Lake Geneva, he overhears forest pines, which are often thirsty here. Of course, they don't say this verbatim. Zweifel translates their utterances. Their whispering is actually made up of ultrasound signals that are electronically transformed into audible sound. This is called sonification by the experts. The result sounds like clicks and pops. Do trees talk? Are plants whispering? Does a carrot scream when a vegetarian bites into it with a clear conscience? In the end, do vegetables not only have the ability to express themselves, but even something like ears? Or, more generally, does the plant kingdom communicate? Oaks as orchestral musicians, this somewhat frightening idea is not entirely new. Esotericists have been embracing trees for some time. There is a widespread belief that potted plants that we talk to thrive better than those that are just watered. There are farmers who play music by Vivaldi or Mozart in their fields because they are sure that this will increase the yield. Even in fairy tales and myths, trees naturally join together to form a forest that has an eye and a too often sinister will. And when, in the 1970s, plants were filmed in time-lapse and seen searching for food, cooperating or waging war, many were convinced that plants move like human beings and animals, only extremely slowly. This called parascientists to the scene, but soon unease spread even among serious researchers. Bioacousticians, who usually research animal voices, began to think about plants. Plant communication researchers were smiled at or marveled at. And even a new, not uncontroversial field of research emerged: plant neurobiology. Here, people discussed brain-like structures in the plant kingdom, plant synapses, and even plant intelligence. There was talk of thinking cabbage. Roman Zweifel is more modest. He does not want to be a tree whisperer. What he overhears is purely one-way communication. Tree whispering, he says, occurs when the flow of water from the roots to the leaves breaks off, as happens during drought. Small bangs in the ultrasonic range are then emitted. This connection has been known for decades. Zweifel, however, was the first to make the signals audible in collaboration with sound artists and computer musicians. In San Francisco, he and the sound artist Marcus Mader performed the concert Trees Downy Oak. Downy oaks from the native valley yowled, howled, and sighed from suspended spherical boxes, accompanied by the trickling sound of strings. The song of the downy oak was reminiscent of a carpet of sound suitable for meditation. Zweifel is convinced that he can learn a lot from the sounds of pine and oak, that they have more to say than thirst. They could talk about the weather, for example, about the soil, or about whether their stomachs are rumbling. Trees might even have something to say about global climate change, and in this way perhaps one day take on a watchdog function. The signals are still diffuse and misunderstood, says Zweifel. But one day, he is sure, he will hear the trees speak. Wild tobacco is the absolute chatterbox. In the Mojave Desert in southwestern Utah, another man is checking a plant. It has grown about a meter high, has soft leaves without thorns, small white flowers. Nicotiana attenuata, the wild tobacco. Considered by plant communication researchers to be one of the most loquacious plants par excellence. The man in the desert is Ian Baldwin, director at the Max Planck Institute for Chemical Ecology in Jena, Department of Molecular Ecology. For decades he has been interested in the communication of wild tobacco with the surrounding fauna. Baldwin wants to know, how does tobacco converse with its predators? Because the researcher does not leave it at analysis, but wants to apply his results, also by means of genetic engineering. His experimental plantations in Germany will be destroyed if they are not banned anyway. That is why the man and his team are so often in the American desert. You do not even need to ask Ian Baldwin whether plants communicate. He enthusiastically reports on his observations, which sounds so unbelievable that it's as if you've stumbled into a fairy tale. Nicotine is a powerful neurotoxin produced by the tobacco plant to deter predators such as caterpillars. The caterpillars are paralyzed or they do not bite at all because nicotine stinks. Unfortunately, there are also caterpillars that do not mind nicotine. This is the offspring of the tobacco hawk moth. But Nicotiana attenuata is clever. It can tell from the caterpillar's chewing rhythm and saliva whether a tobacco hawk moth caterpillar is at work. Then it immediately changes its defense strategy and begins to scream. The plant is actually calling for help, Baldwin says. Its language, however, is not based on sounds. It consists of volatile enzymes. These attract predatory bugs and wasps, the enemies of its enemies. The wasps lay their eggs in the caterpillars, the bugs suck the caterpillars dry. Attracting specific species in a targeted manner is already a memorable achievement of the tobacco plant. At best, one would have thought animals capable of such a feat. But the astonishing manipulative possibilities of tobacco are by no means exhausted with the chemical summoning of enemy foes. If things get too bad with the tobacco moth caterpillars, the nightshade plant opens its flowers during the day instead of at night when the moths are on the move. This attracts hummingbirds, which take over the pollen distribution. And, as if the subtleties were not enough, the tobacco also controls the birds. Hummingbirds are lazy. They prefer to collect nectar near their nests. But Nicotiana attenuata does not like that at all. To spread the tobacco plant's genetic material as widely as possible, the plant uses a trick reminiscent of Russian roulette. It mixes nicotine into the flower nectar in a random distribution. When the hummingbirds come across a poisoned flower, they spit out the stinking juice and flutter off to look for uncontaminated nectar elsewhere, carrying the pollen far and wide. The fact that plants have developed such sophisticated and effective mechanisms to fight animal enemies is due to their immobility. They cannot flee. They must therefore be much smarter than animals, which can run away, says Baldwin, full of respect for plant abilities. Certain fungi are basically news, M's. What mechanisms has the plant developed that is under enormous pressure to adapt because of the harsh conditions in the desert and in the face of numerous threats from predators? Can the genetic switches be found? Re-engineered? Last but not least, agriculture could benefit. After all, compared to wild tobacco, cultivated varieties of maize, tomatoes, and wheat are as dumb as bean straw. How great it would be if the stupid seeds could be restored to the cleverness of the original wild forms. And the field is far from being illuminated. Researchers like Ian Baldwin have just discovered an underground communication channel of plants that has been largely ignored until now. The roots of most plants are connected to each other through so-called mycorrhizae. These are sometimes huge underground networks of symbiotically intertwined roots and fungi. In a thimbleful of healthy earth, there are kilometers of such fungal networks. In the forest, they can connect trees over a distance of 30 meters. It has been known for some time that different plant individuals warn each other of predators by emitting special scents. We know this from bean plants, which signal to their relatives when they are attacked by aphids. But now studies show that although the chemical language can be silenced by encapsulating the individual plants, word of an aphid attack spreads immediately. The fungal network acts as an information channel. Scientists are already talking about the plant internet.
Above the earth, capitalism reigns. Under the earth, however, a socialist network rules. Ian Baldwin, molecular biologist.
What this means for plant communication research is not yet clear. What, for example, follows from the finding that conventionally cultivated soils hardly know such symbiotic systems anymore? Could artificial pesticides perhaps be saved through appropriate mycorrhizae? Much room for future research. Some connections even point to downright social strategies within the flora. Biologists generally assume that there is brutal competition between plants above the earth. The stronger plant robs the weaker one of light, water, and nutrients. One thrives, the others wither away. But to the astonishment of the scientists, a small donation of phosphate injected into a single plant soon benefits all the surrounding plants. A social redistribution takes place through the underground network. Ian Baldwin recognizes how plants conduct politics. Above the earth, capitalism reigns. Under the earth, however, a socialist network reigns.
Source 6. Bioacoustic plant communication. Say through the root researchers have discovered that plants communicate with cracking noises produced by their roots in a hitherto unexplained way.
It sounds so unbelievable that you might think it was an April Fool's joke. But the study has been published in the renowned journal Trends in Plant Science, written by Daniel Robert Bristol, Stefano Mancuso Florence, and Monica Galliano Perth. The researchers had asked themselves whether there might be still unknown communication channels in plants, that is to say, other languages than those biochemical signals that are sent out when a predator approaches. Galliano then observed recurring, regular cracking noises in the range of around 220 Hz on the roots of young cereal plants. Now, these sounds could merely be a side effect of growth if another finding did not complete the picture. It is precisely in the frequency range of 220 Hz that plant roots align themselves with the acoustic source during their growth. Plants, therefore, have sensitive organs that react to sound waves. The researchers believe that this is no coincidence. The crackling sounds are a communication signal between two plants. It is still unclear exactly how the sounds are produced and what information they convey.
Source 7. Previously unknown plant communication promotes growth. Wednesday, the 8th of May, 2013.
Crawley, Australia. Plants are usually considered comparatively silent organisms, and attempts to communicate with them are rather one-sided pleasure. More and more. However, researchers are finding out that plants can also communicate with each other even directly and in different ways, and perceive their environment in a much more complex way than previously assumed. A current study by Australian scientists now proves that apparently a previously unknown form of communication between neighbouring plants promotes or inhibits the growth of individual plants, even of different species, and that this plant language possibly even takes place acoustically. As Monica Galliano and Michael Renton from the University of Western Australia report in the journal Biomed Central, they were able to show in their experiments that significantly more chili seeds, Capsicum annuum, started to grow when they were sown next to other chili plants or Basilicum basilicum. Even when the known communication pathways were prevented in the experiment by placing the seeds in a dark plastic bag, the seeds germinated just as well and again better in plant neighborhood than when they were sown alone. This circumstance leads the scientists to assume that there is a kind of communication between the plants by means of nanomechanical vibrations. The researchers were also able to observe a comparable effect of the plants under and on each other using adult plants. Our results show that the plants are able to positively influence each other's growth through a mechanism that is as yet unknown, explains Galliano. Bad neighbors, on the other hand, for example fennel, prevented chili seeds from germinating on the same scale as it was promoted by basil. We suspect that the answer may lie in acoustic signals generated by the plants using nanomechanical vibrations inside their cells, allowing neighboring plants to rapidly communicate with each other. As early as 2012, Australian scientists were able to demonstrate that plants not only respond to sounds, but probably even communicate with each other themselves through clicking noises.
However, this has nothing to do with consciousness perception, but it is founded in the fact that all plants have numerous and highly sensitive perception systems based on very fine electricity.
This is what Svath taught me, as well as that plants have very valuable strategies through which they can, as I mentioned, self-protect against injury and other damaging environmental influences.
This is also correct, although there is no nervous system associated with it, but rather, for example, a fine electrical conduction system with which they can also protect themselves, as, among other things, against being eaten by animals and vermin. In relation to this stimulus conduction system, it is possible to speak in a certain way of a similarity of action in relation to the human nervous system, but only in an extremely remote sense. In order to protect themselves from neighboring plants, parasites or predators, various plants can also secrete toxins, or emit poisonous gases in order to protect or warn neighboring plants, whereby the stimulus conductors also generate corresponding very fine electrical impulses which control all defensive actions. Of course, this has many advantages for the plants, which in this way are self-organizing and capable of making ultra-fine electrical impulses, so that, for example, if grass is eaten by an animal or beast or cut off by human beings, it will still be able to make ultra-fine electrical impulses or even a very fine electrical impulse to protect itself. It is therefore self-deciding that it generates fine electrical impulses and stimulates its growth again, whereby it grows again, namely by mobilizing reserve substances in an impulse-energetic way and promotes the growth anew.
Also, certain plants can warn their neighboring plants of attackers by emitting a gaseous hormone, as I can still remember Svath explaining, man, that is over 70 years ago, how time flies.
Stimulus systems with electrical conduction and action potentials in plants, however, do not mean that pain sensations could be present with them, which is also true for precious and normal rocks, as well as for all gases, minerals, and crystals, but also for microorganisms such as bacilli, insects, and viruses, etc.
But there are very highly developed plants that have grown beyond the stage of the finest electric impulse forms and have thus evolved higher. But not on Earth, because these exoplants fall outside the earthly plant norms.
But that is not what is being talked about.
If, for example, a branch is sawn off a tree or a gash is cut into the trunk, then there is no sensation of pain, whereby the tree already forms a thin layer at the cut or blow site in a short time, which corresponds to a natural wound closure. Svath also commented that there is no evolutionary need for plants of all genera and species to be pain, classified because they are stationary bound as a result of their organism, and therefore a sensation of pain would be so counterproductive that they would die from even a minor injury.
Your memory of being taught by my father is waking up again.
Which I am always happy about. The events, however, bring me no joy concerning the things that unfold in the form of the refugee tragedies, and that nothing useful is undertaken against this.
With your various predictions in the 1950s and 1960s as well as 1970 HS, You have warned the world governments about these events, as these have already come about for quite some time. You had even sent your predictions to many daily newspapers and radio stations in Europe and the US, but no one has responded to these. If your predictions were read at all, then you were ridiculed as a foolish dreamer and do-gooder. Consequently, nothing was undertaken to make decisive and valueful preparations, precisely in order to take the necessary measures to prevent the whole thing.
And even today there is nothing really useful undertaken to put an end to everything. On the one hand, this is because the rulers are too foolish, too dim-witted, as well as absolutely unable to see the effective reality and its truth, and to rightly assess everything. But on the other hand, also a blatant erroneous humanism stands in the foreground, which however is given not only with the rulers in sanctimonious form, but especially with the aid organizations which thereby can beg for a lot of money, as well as the people themselves, who are unable to effectively assess the facts of the matter. And if voices are raised, such as from the Australian government, which explains that Europe needs to change its tune, just as the Australians likewise do, then the advice givers are shouted down and accused of being misanthropic, unhumane, and hostile to foreigners, as well as racially hostile ones. On television, rulers and government representatives as well as erroneous humanists spout banally, primitively dense, foolishly and idiotically in discussion broadcasts about the refugee problem, in which however only endless absolute rubbish and nonsense is regurgitated. With all the talk is also never of the fact that most so-called refugees are nothing other than economic refugees, and in no wise are their lives threatened, which would entitle them to escape to safety. And nothing is said about the fact that a certain percentage of these economic refugees live off of welfare in the wealthy industrialized nations, at the expense of hard-working taxpayers, and yet at the same time become serious criminals. The drug trade is thereby likewise in the foreground, as well as burglaries, theft, fraud, and even manslaughter and murder, etc. Of course, this cannot be generalized, because in every case it is always only a certain percentage which must be taken into consideration regarding this. The life-threatened refugees are really truthfully only in small numbers, to whom naturally asylum must also be granted. However, economic refugees belong returned to their ancestral homeland, in which they themselves should strive to build up an existence, and indeed, even if this is hard and connected with very much effort and work. Even to keep some goats, and to cultivate a small plot of land in order to obtain their own food, and perhaps also to be able to sell some of it, can be a good start instead of holding out the empty hands to let them fill up with foodstuffs free of charge by aid organizations. Exactly this, however, that in the developing countries the human being even reaches for the rake and does something, is prevented by the aid organizations, because if the roasted pigeons are put in the mouth of a human being, then he or she has no further interest thereto, to do something else for this themselves. That's the one thing, and the other is that in general, the economic refugees are not downright poor, but have at their disposal a certain capital which they could usefully use in their homeland and, as I said, so that some modest small existence could be built up. But no, the money will be utilized for the flight out of the homeland, and these are shamefully abandoned, in the hope to quickly become rich in the industrialized countries, and without too much effort. Therefore, contrary to every rationality and every individual initiative and love of the homeland, the money is handed over to criminal smugglers and black marketeers of human beings, that is to say human traffickers, who smuggle them out of their countries of origin into countries of transit and ultimately ship them out on inflatable boats, unseaworthy fishing cutters, and other floating death traps, which rigorously with Gevalt would have to be broken up and destroyed by professionally trained elite troops, precisely by a multinational peace-fighting troop. Also to say with regard to these smuggler and human being trafficking boats, is that sooner or later these usually go down in the sea due to their dilapidated condition and the overloading of human beings, or are mercilessly and consciencelessly scuppered on the open sea along with man and mouse by the criminal human being traffickers themselves. And if it is considered that the economic refugees and also well-to-do refugees of war pay per person, depending 4,500, so 6,000, and even up to 8,000. Or more euros for a crossing from a transit country on the Mediterranean Sea to Sicily or Greece, etc., by which the conscienceless ones and criminal smugglers become multimillionaires. Then that should stimulate thinking over how poor these refugees really are and what they could do with the money in their home country in order to build up a modest existence and also to do something about it, even if it's only very slight, in order to improve the poor condition of the home country. In this respect, something valuable can alone be done therethrough, by placing humaneness for the fellow human being in the light of day and standing by and helping them with word and deed. This, however, is not taken into consideration by the economic refugees, because also in these countries from which they come, the humaneness for the fellow human being and love for the next one as well as the help for the next ones are little sown. So whoever does not want to, this one will not, because it's simpler and is more comfortable to live in those foreign states at the expense of the people and to make the cupped hands, where a good government structure, clear laws and regulations, and a good economy are created. It must of course also be clear that the whole thing has nothing to do with the nature of economic refugees. If human beings effectively migrate from developing countries into prosperous foreign states in accordance with law and right, and according to regulatory authorizations and consents, as is customary and rightful worldwide. However, such human beings are provided with all the necessary papers and with the equally necessary financial means. They are or work-wise will be bound to a company and therefore also lead an orderly life, just as they also completely amply do the civic duties in the host country or new homeland. Quite a few human beings who come from developing countries in this wise also conduct a long-standing occupational study of some kind and integrate themselves extensively in their new homeland, where as a rule they are also qualified and good citizens of the state. However, these human beings are never to be equated with economic refugees, who flee their homelands only for reasons of which, because they have erroneously fallen into the delusion that in the wealthy industrialized countries they would only have to pick up the golden apples which would fall from the trees. Even to have to pick them themselves would already be too much for them. All this is considered just as minimally in any wise by the erroneous humanists and aid organizations as well, as by the leaders of the wealthy industrialized countries, especially foremost in Europe by the responsible ones of the EU dictatorship, as also neither from their representatives and the far too humane political parties and private erroneous humanists. This also includes all the anonymous wrong philanthropists, human fanatics and aid organizations, who raise the whole economic refugee problem ever further through their feeble-minded machinations, instead of rigorously preventing it and granting admittance into the country and with it also asylum, only to those refugees who actually and verifiably must be considered for any effective acceptable reasons as life-threatening in their homeland. Not only, however, the right of asylum and any support would have to be denied to purely economic refugees, but rigorously and without exception there must also take place a return, that is to say, a repatriation back to their homeland. This on the one hand, whilst finally establishing a multinational peace-fighting troop on the other hand, and it must be ensured in the dictatorial home countries of the economic refugees that the dictatorships are abolished and replaced by true democracies, and with this healthy state regulations would also be created, with all the trimmings through which the living conditions could also improve in the country to the benefit of all human beings. This coupled with the fact that in these countries through appropriate and humanely correct measures, also the economic refugee problem would be prevented. And concerning this, which relates to the homelands of the economic refugees, must equally apply also to the transit countries, through which the economic refugees are smuggled. Thus also likewise by necessity in this respect, would be the use of a peace-fighting troop of multinational form, as well as with regard to a monitoring of all the sea areas, so that no further flows of economic refugees can be put to sea. And by the same token, the multinational peace-fighting troops should also see to it that the people smugglers and human traffickers would be fought everywhere, brought to a standstill, and the fallible ones severely punished, which only by a lifelong deportation into an area of banishment would be right. All these factors, however, will be considered neither by the leaders of the industrialized countries, particularly by the EU dictatorship and by their representatives, nor by public offices, wrong aid organizations, political parties, and by all erroneous humanists, because on the one hand it all does not matter to them. They are hypocritical ones and not directly personally affected by everything, and on the other, because they indulge in an erroneous humanism that makes them blind to the reality and its truth. And with regard to the erroneous humanists, it is to be directly said that as a result of an erroneous and hypocritical understanding of humaneness, they do not see the reality and its truth, and indeed very often, therefore, because they are blinded by false religious and sectarian irrational teachings, and everything is looked at and considered from a religious sectarian euphoric view and belief, that they do something good with their wrong humanism on the one hand, and on the other would act divinely, or in the sense of Jesus Christ, or according to a real love for the next one. That they, however, with that only further promote the whole misery and propel it higher and higher instead of ending it. They lose no thoughts over this, and therefore indeed not, because with regard to the wrong humanism, they are suggestively blinded by the whisperings of the religions and sects, so that they are not able to recognize, let alone to understand the reality and its truth. So the whole misery goes on and increases more and more, and for this in Europe especially. The responsible ones are the leaders of the EU dictatorship as well as their representatives and the actual erroneous humanists from among the people, as well as the erroneous aid organizations of the Christian religion and its sects. All these are the ones who wrap themselves in a fraudulent halo and reject all the necessary rigorous measures, and believe know-it-alls as well as megalomaniacs that they could resolve the terrible things through wrong humanistic measures, although they are so foolish and asinine that they could neither recognize the effective reality nor its truth, and also not understand that they only make everything even worse with what they decide upon and do. They believe that if they knock one head off the Hydra economic refugee serpent, that they would thus also destroy the other problems. But this is a hugely erroneous belief. Because the economic refugee problem is like the Lernaean Hydra, that is to say the gigantic Hydra serpent of Greek mythology, which was endowed with 9 heads and lived in the swamps of Lerna. When a head was knocked off of it, then for each one, it subsequently grew 2 new ones, and the main head, that is to say the 9th head, was even immortal. Only if the decapitation wound of a knocked-off head was cauterized with fire could it be prevented that 2 new heads formed. Only in this way was it possible that even the immortal head fell off and the Hydra perished. Just in the same wise, it is possible that an end can be prepared to the rampant and continuous disaster of the refugees increasing with no limit and everything normalizes itself again, because only in this way, rigorously severing head by head as well as the main head of the refugee Hydra, and that the wounds are fully cauterized, can an end to the whole thing be prepared and once again a healthy, normal state brought about. However, the rulers and their deputies prevent precisely that, and namely by only wanting to fight against symptoms, such as through the imbecility that increasingly sea rescue boats should be sent out into the Mediterranean to pick up and to rescue refugees who have fallen into distress at sea. For this reason, immensely more money should be made available by the EU dictatorship. And of course most notably Angela Merkel beats the drum for this, the ignorant, foolish EU dictator, and is of the brain-dead opinion that thereby a problem would be solved. And what is otherwise once again to be clearly said, the entirety of the economic refugee problem has nothing to do with those refugees whose lives are threatened in their homelands by religious, sectarian, and political terror as well as by acts of war and so on, which is why for the safety of their lives they will flee and must seek refuge and asylum in other countries. With regard to such refugees, it is a duty as a human being that they are helped in every necessary wise and protection is granted to them. But even such refugees can afford an escape, only if they have enough money, just at least as much as they need for the escape. Namely, if the human beings are poor as a mouse, then they cannot flee into a prosperous industrialized country, but only in a neighboring country, where they miserably vegetate away in refugee camps. And these refugees are the ones who need the help most of all, and who, worthy of life, need to be supplied with all necessary goods and medicines through fair aid organizations from the wealthy industrialized countries And in truth, this urgently needed help is lacking everywhere. And indeed not least because too little money is there. Because the aid organizations usually themselves pocket 40% of their collected funds to cover their expenses, etc. Therefore not a voluntary, but rather only a paid assistance is provided, and precisely an inadequate one at that. And if certain countries, such as Switzerland, hypocritically take such refugees into its country for political reasons and for the sake of image cultivation, then this happens only through a really tough selection, and also in a wise that not the poorest. Rather, only refugees are chosen who have a certain status and who can stand in a good light and are able to promote themselves during the selecting. I see the whole thing like this, and there is yet a lot more to say, because many factors still have not been addressed.
You speak entirely within my sense, although you must be clear to yourself that you will not exactly reap joy and encouragement from the governments, the erroneous humanists and aid organizations, etc., because they cannot correct their wrong thoughts, views, and opinions. Contrary to all intellect and all rationality, and indeed not, because they are trapped therein and in their might behavior without hope of rescue and also nourish completely wrong modes of behavior. Intellect and rationality are thus severely affected with them and are effectively in short supply, so that they are blind towards the reality and its truth, and therefore also cannot logically follow it. But now, dear Edward, my friend, you seem to be very tired, which is probably another consequence of the suffering you have gone through. So I will go, so that you may rest.
You actually see me on the rims. Consequently, I will go straight to bed when you have gone your way.
Then I say goodbye to you, but also get well soon. Farewell, dear friend.
Take care and goodbye, Ptah.